Start streaming. Okay, our event is live. We are live. Hello, everyone out there on the internet. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. Tonight we are talking about Venezuela, the crisis in Venezuela. So this being a basic income discussion group, we're going to try to see how basic income might fit into the picture in Venezuela. You know, could it make some kind of a difference? You know, what makes basic income possible in a situation like that? Because we usually talk about basic income in the context of, you know, a place like the United States where, you know, the economy is doing great and we really just want people to, you know, buy what the economy can produce for them and that kind of thing. So Venezuela has all kinds of problems with their economy, including hyperinflation and shortages of goods that people need. You know, hospitals aren't able to get supplies, you know, that kind of thing. And obviously, as the article says, a lot of people are leaving Venezuela because they can't really survive there adequately. So I want to start by going around the room and getting people's thoughts on the crisis in Venezuela and what you think the viability of something like a basic income would be in a situation like this, or whether you think it would help or hurt, you know, given the hyperinflation and everything else. So we'll start with Bethany.
Yeah, I don't really feel that I have an answer to that yet. All I really know about it I got from this article just now, so I'd have to think a little bit more about that question, I think.
Wow,
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to pass.
Okay, that's fine. You
Also,
can pass.
I haven't read the article, sorry to say, and it's so complicated and there's a history that I don't know, and I'm sure that will come up. But
Yeah.
My name is Julian. I'm glad to participate in the discussion,
Okay.
hopefully in a productive way. Yes, Venezuela is really a tragic situation. I've watched it unfold from the time Hugo Chavez was still alive many years ago, and I also don't know a great deal about what happened before then, about the turn of the millennium, but maybe initially he had some sort of idea related to basic income, but a much grander kind of societal vision, and maybe a better example of basic income, perhaps for another week, we can discuss a program they have in Brazil that actually is just like a kind of basic stipend.
Bolsa Familia.
Bolsa Familia, that's right. But anyway, I'm glad to discuss the situation in Venezuela. I have several colleagues who are from there as well, who were directly affected. They've emigrated, and so, yeah, not in political terms, just hopefully have a thoughtful policy debate.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, it says in the article that minimum wage is going to, later in the month or something like that, going to increase by 34 times or something like that. So I think it would be more efficient to just have a basic income and not have the worry about the minimum wage or anything like that, because it would just be a more efficient allocation of funds.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the biggest thing that happened, I mean, like, a lot of things happened in Venezuela that caused the markets to work less efficiently. So, you know, Hugo Chavez put in price controls and, you know, added subsidies to things he thought people needed. So then, you know, like, it's hard to determine what prices are and stuff like that. And on top of that, they have this whole oil thing. So Venezuela, the main thing that their economy does is it exports oil. So the economy was already weakened by kind of a lot of these policies in 2014, and you know, it was very difficult for private industry, other than the oil exporting business, which was kind of controlled by the government. It was very difficult for private industry to get on its foot because Venezuela doesn't have very good private property protection. So if there's a business that's successful in Venezuela, then the government comes in and appropriates it, and then it's, you know, if you know that the government is going to do that, that creates a disincentive to actually create a profitable, productive business. So what ended up happening in Venezuela was that all the other kinds of businesses kind of went by the wayside. And as long as the price of oil was high and they could export oil, it kind of worked okay. But then in 2014, the price of oil came way down. Hey guys.
Hi, sorry, we're late.
Trio,
That's
no
all right.
worries.
So in 2014, the price of oil came way down, and now suddenly Venezuela couldn't trade for the things they needed anymore in the global economy. So as a result of that, Venezuela and the people of Venezuela had a lot less access to stuff. They couldn't produce their own stuff because it's all an oil exporting economy. So in the real world, when something like that happens, when it's as if Venezuela got hit by an asteroid and lost, a ton of their productive capacity because they could no longer, sell this oil stuff and get the stuff they needed.
But there are other countries that rely on oil production and exporting that are doing fine.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what the difference is here.
So there's a big difference is in how they responded to it, how their economy was set up beforehand. It wasn't just that they were stuck with oil, but also their economy, in terms of the markets functioning properly, was kind of destroyed by the policies.
In like Saudi Arabia or
it's somewhat different in Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking
Go
about
ahead,
Saudi
Richard.
Arabia.
I think a more accurate analogy for Venezuela is that it's like that one episode of Star Trek where they have the Star Trek Next Generation, where there's this one country, planet where all they do is just sell narcotics to the other planet, and they're completely dependent on the sale of narcotics. And so they can't sell, if they can't sell narcotics anymore, their whole way of life is going to collapse, and that's what happened to Venezuela.
Yeah, so in economics they call this the Dutch disease. Go ahead, Julian.
I was going to say, so they, in terms of revenues, they compounded the problem with price by firing all of the competent technical personnel from the National Petroleum Company.
Yeah.
So they had a precipitous decline in output as well in terms of their exports. And then that happened a couple of years before.
Well, they just fired and a lot of them left.
Well,
right.
or they're forced out.
So I mean, like,
they put people who were patently not qualified to run oil fields.
So as we talk about this, we're going to come across plenty of examples for things the Venezuelan administration did that caused the economy not to function as well. So this is a prime example of that, and there's going to be plenty more as we go along. But ultimately, what matters is, and I'm going to start with a quote from the article here. On the most basic level, there are more people wanting to purchase goods than the number of goods available. So then you get inflation. Now, all of these things, including the incompetent oil stuff, all of that reduces the number of goods that Venezuela can produce, or the number of goods that Venezuelan people have access to. So if you want to keep prices stable in a situation like that, what you really need to do is make sure that you have less. So you'd expect everyone to be poorer. So what you really need to do is decrease the amount of consumer spending so that the consumer spending stays in line with the productive capacity of the economy. Now, you don't want to kill the productive capacity of the economy in the first place, but that's what they did. And once you've done that, you really need to, get people's spending power at the level that corresponds with the very small amount of wealth that is available for them to purchase.
How did the productive capacity get ruined other than the oil?
Well, I guess that's part of what he was saying before, is like there was a strong disincentive for anything else besides
because
oil.
of private property.
Nationalization of the profitable businesses.
Well,
That's what he was saying before.
Not just that, but they mandated prices. So a lot of businesses, why would you make toothpaste in a country where the government is going to subsidize imported toothpaste to keep it at a certain price, or you have to sell it for a loss?
So there's all kinds of things they did. Like, everyone's coming up with examples for ways in which the Venezuela economy was kind of broken and the markets weren't working. And then the kind of straw that broke the camel's back was the crash in oil prices, because that was really kind of like what was keeping them barely afloat. So that happened in 2014.
Right.
And is communism part of the problem? I mean, the ideology itself about property and about ownership, socialism. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you try to implement stuff like that, then it changes the market incentives. And if the markets aren't working efficiently, then you're not going to be able to produce as much.
And it sounds like they didn't manage to effectively, try to have any sort of government-run businesses besides the oil either, or
well, they sort of tried to. Kind of. I mean, there was a lot of corruption, so the business would get taken over by the government, and then all the executives, instead of caring about producing the stuff efficiently, would go out and buy fancy new cars and like that kind of stuff. Yeah. So there's that element too. And I just wanted to say that, so Ron was the one, so Ron is sometimes on the live stream. He was the one who suggested this discussion. And he was wondering why Venezuela was having this problem with hyperinflation, whereas a country like Honduras, which is similarly, suffering from corruption and very, high murder rates and, like a lot of the social problems, but their currency is fine. And I think the key to that is that they really didn't institute a lot of the economic, well, first of all, they're not an oil country. They're a little bit more diversified. They're an agricultural economy, so they actually produce the thing that they can eat. You can't eat oil, so that helps. But then they also didn't implement a lot of the leftist policies that were inefficient for the markets that were implemented by Hugo Chavez. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Another thing is that it says in the article that they borrowed a lot in dollars, and they couldn't afford that after the collapse of the oil, and so they printed their way out of the, and so that was the issue. They couldn't.
Yeah. So I mean, you're borrowing in dollars. Part of the reason why they had to borrow in dollars was they couldn't borrow in their own currency anymore. So the fact that they had to borrow in dollars is a reflection of the lack of credit that the government has, that the Venezuelan government has.
Borrow from where? Borrowing dollars from where? From their own government?
From countries that have dollars.
Institutional investors, the World Bank.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So one interesting thing, though, is most countries can't borrow in their own currency.
Right.
Most countries do borrow in dollars, so like that in and of itself is not an indicator of any trouble.
Right.
If dollars, yen, or euros are kind of the international standards for borrowing in currencies.
I think that's right. So it's not in itself indicative of a problem, but I wanted to point out that the United States can borrow in its own currency, and that doesn't necessarily give it special privileges. It's more a reflection of how much credit the United States government has.
Yeah.
So the fact that other countries are borrowing in dollars means that the level but the level at which the international community trusts them is not as high as the level at which the international community trusts the dollar and the US bank, that kind of thing. So it's all a continuum. And if we tank our credit, we could end up like Venezuela. We just have a lot further to go before we hit that point. Yeah.
We hope.
Is that what this meeting is about?
This meeting is about.
We can get there.
Yeah.
I think the contrary, actually. Like, it's kind of about the contrast between what's different about a situation like Venezuela and here, and how can you see it like on the continuum of what kind of capacity you have to basically like provide stuff at a steady rate to your citizens, right? Yeah. And that includes what you produce, what other people are willing to give you, what other people are willing to loan you to buy stuff from other places. Like, all of that kind of feeds into what kind of production you're actually able to put into the hands of people that to kind of track your currency level, right, so that it can stay stable. Does that make sense? So the U.S. is in a really different place right now than Venezuela was with those things.
So I think the way to sum it up is to say that any country's spending is constrained by the credit of that country's government. And if you go beyond the level by which everybody trusts you, then you get inflation. And a big part of what supports the credit of the government is the productive capacity of the country's economy. So if you can produce a lot of stuff, then that money can go towards buying that stuff. Sometimes you get in situations where countries really want to export a lot of stuff to another country and ask for nothing in return. Like China wants to sell us a bunch of cheap stuff. They don't care about getting anything in return except for dollars, and we can print those. But I would say that is kind of pathological. China's making a mistake here.
Well, they do care about other things, but that's a different discussion.
They care about other things, yeah. But the fact that they keep wanting to sell us cheap stuff and all we have to do is send them things that we can create means...
Well, they use those things we create to buy things here.
Yeah, but in terms of the difference, so we have a trade deficit with China, so...
I'm not talking about the trade deficit, I'm talking about they will buy companies. Like they own Lowe's, the AMC theater chain is owned by the Chinese. They paid, $25 billion for it, or whatever the number is. Yeah. Like they are buying real assets, and that's not necessarily discussed in the trade balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true.
Yeah.
But overall, I mean, it's the fact that they are sending us stuff and taking money, I think, is an advantage for us.
Yeah.
And if the countries were all acting rationally, China probably wouldn't be doing this. Countries wouldn't be trying to like export as much as possible. They would care about their own citizens, how much stuff their citizens can get. And if countries want to import, if you can import stuff for cheap from other places, that's kind of good for your citizens. Anyway, that's kind of like a tangent.
Well, it's related in the sense of like part of the problem with Venezuela's productive capacity that becomes really obvious is that a big part of their productive capacity was what they were able to bring in terms of material stuff from other countries in exchange for the oil and then the money they got for that, and that's kind of breaking down.
And China's not interested in selling a bunch of cheap stuff to Venezuela for Venezuelan bolivars.
Exactly.
They don't have that kind of arrangement set up the way we have with China. So Venezuela is maybe constrained by their productive capacity more, like their local productive capacity, more than the United States is, because the United States can keep importing from China as long as China wants to do that.
It seems like it's a little bit of like a snowball effect, though. Like if you don't have, I don't know, like they feed into each other a bit. Like if you don't have good ability to have productive capacity locally so that you can make sure to keep your currency stable in that way, then other countries probably also don't want your currency, so they don't want to send you a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's generally how you would expect it to work, and that's probably similar to how it is working with Venezuela. But it's not how it's working with the United States. Like, we are getting disproportionately more stuff.
But that wasn't really my point. My point was more about like what happens when you see this sort of things kind of breaking down. Like they kind of feed into each other when they're breaking down.
Yeah. So, actually, can you say more? What you mean by that?
It wasn't a super sophisticated point. I was just saying like. You lose the kind of credit capacity, like to have people want to take your currency in exchange for stuff more when you're not keeping your local currency stable, which is related to like what you can produce locally and other monetary policy things, like whether you still hike up the minimum wage even when you can't produce anything to like match that and so on. There's other factors too, but
I think that's.
I was just saying I vaguely have a sense of sort of like a downward spiral once you hit a certain point, where you're losing credit internationally, so you're losing that aspect of productive capacity too.
So I think if you do have some productive capacity on your own end and you do have functioning markets in your country, then there's a limit to how far down it can go, because maybe no one wants to sell you stuff, but you can at least make your own stuff.
Right.
Venezuela can't make their own stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's the problem.
Right.
And if they want to kind of be able to start kind of supporting themselves, they're going to have to fix some of the problems with their market. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Maybe this is not off topic, I'm not sure, but from what you were saying a second ago, that you think that like a nation's ability to, or the amount of credit it has, or access to credit has to do with its productive capacity. Maybe it's smart. Maybe the path that China has been on will put them in a position, if the credit is backed by the productive capacity of the country, they've certainly increased that dramatically over the last couple of decades.
I mean, I think they can increase the productive capacity and be producing for their own citizens. So if they had a basic income, their own citizens could buy their stuff instead of having to import it from the United States, or instead of having to export it to the United States.
But I mean, if we were imagine what paths, if you're in charge of China and you are trying to get to a place where every other country has to borrow in your currency. Yeah. Then, if the key to that is growing your nation's productive capacity, then maybe they're doing a great job.
So I think they're doing a great job of building their productive capacity, but the fact that they're building that productive capacity and then just using it to give out gifts to the whole world is perhaps not what's best for their people. So they could build the productive capacity. And have that benefit their people directly, I think that would.
I think Nick's just saying like that's an easier thing to change than whether or not you have productive capacity. Like they could.
What's an easier thing?
Like they could pretty quickly start using it on their own for their own citizens if they wanted to, whereas it might take like decades to build up the productive capacity.
But they could be using it. So the only mistake that they're making, I would say, is the fact that they're not producing for their own citizens right now,
or not as much as they could be.
Yeah. And I think if I were in charge of China, what I would do to take over the world is I would pay my citizens a basic income. I would allow the markets maybe to be less constrained than they are now in China with some of like the communist restrictions and stuff like that. And that would create an incentive for people to produce things for Chinese citizens. So that includes Chinese businesses, and it includes foreign businesses if they want to sell things to Chinese citizens who have money to spend. So I think that's the smarter way to take over the world if you're China, rather than exporting, sell to your own citizens. Yeah.
Sounds really similar to a plan you have for another country.
Plan have for every country.
I think the counter argument that they would make is that I think to your point, they're kind of doing that now. They have a semi-pegged currency that they're experimenting with. It's just their whole philosophy is that we're not going to do this free market stuff that's not really working in the West. We're going to control things and just take it really slow. So I think what I think you're saying is actually, I mean, they have that in their plan, and they do have the productive capacity to have a strong currency nation that is competitive with the U.S. dollar. It's just that because they keep their markets closed, the international investing community does not have the confidence in this currency yet, because it's not freely convertible.
Yeah, David.
So the semi-peg currency isn't even an issue, really. I mean, a lot of countries have done that historically, and they let their currency trade within a band. It's a relatively narrow band. It's 5 point something to 6 point something US dollars per yuan,
renminbi.
Yeah. But what happens is whenever it approaches that border, all they do is they buy or sell foreign currency to adjust the rate, which is something a lot of countries do.
Yeah.
Like the Swiss have pegged their currency at various points in time, and they're perfectly fine. Their economy still booms. Like other countries have done that, smaller ones, mind you, but other countries have done that for periods of time, and it's fine. And when we had the gold standard, people did that, and it was perfectly fine. It wasn't great all the time, but as a general rule, it was fine. So it's kind of a non-issue.
So how does that relate to what Romo was saying?
Hold on a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
I may be wrong, but as far as I know, what I'm referring to is you're not able to, on a mass scale, just trade the yuan.
Oh,
right.
No, everyone's limited to like $10,000 a year or something like that.
Yeah. I'm talking about what actually drives the currency markets are dealers and speculators, etc., being able to freely trade these currencies.
And they're actually, I think they've opened it up more recently.
This is what I'm referring to. They have a parallel currency, which they're starting to, I don't unfortunately remember the name, but it was in the course. In
the renminbi?
Yeah, like in the money and banking course,
right.
There was
they had
an
the
article
two.
about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that course, of course, is from a few years ago, and since then China has opened up their currency more, and now it's actually been added to the basket of major currencies that's backing the SDR reserves by the IMF. Yeah.
So they have a plan. Rest assured, 30 years from now.
They have a plan, and they've been building capacity pretty well. If I were in charge of China, I think we'd be doing even better. I think I think the free markets would help the capacity build more, and giving money to your own citizens helps keep the fruits of that production with your people. Yeah.
Sorry. Just really quickly, back to your point, they're exporting their labor. Fundamentally, they're not exporting the things; they're exporting their labor.
Well, I mean, you can frame it either way.
They're buying the raw components from other countries, mainly in Australia and Africa, etc., and they're exporting their labor, and they're using what they're getting to buy things from other countries that they can't produce themselves. Like China could only start producing ballpoint pens last year. There are only 4 countries in the world that can. They're the 4th. Like, they couldn't make those before, but because they sold things, they got money, they were able to invest in technology, and they were able to make something that they can use internally to themselves. And yes, they can sell it also, but their quality of life over there is going up so dramatically because they are exporting their labor.
And I mean, they can trade, I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't be exporting. I'm saying they're exporting more than they're importing.
Yeah.
So the stuff that they need to build the ballpoint pens or whatever is stuff they have to import, and they're doing a lot less of that than they're exporting. And what you would expect in a balanced economy is that they'd be roughly exporting at the same level that they're importing. So I guess that's my point mainly. So yeah. Anyway, I think that's enough about China for now.
Sorry.
Let's get back to the article. Where is it? So this is related to what we were just talking about. So its oil revenues account for about 95% of its export earnings. But with the oil price plummeted in 2014, Venezuela was faced with a shortfall of foreign currency. So they couldn't really buy as much stuff from other countries anymore. Essentially, like kind of what's happening, if you take away all the extra stuff with currency and all of that, is that they're selling oil to the world, and the world is selling stuff back for them, back to them. But if the world doesn't want oil, they can't get the stuff they need. So that's kind of another way of looking at it. Yeah. So we've got a couple people on the live stream. Matthew Bowler is talking about corrupt money. Teleslu says, on Venezuela can't make their own stuff. They used to be the headquarters of the most multinational companies in Latin America. And I think that's right. And so Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998, and he started bringing in a lot of these policies that caused people not to want to do business in Venezuela anymore. So then it really, like, all that was left was the oil. By the time we got to like 2010 or so. So yeah, so that's a big part of what happened. And he's talking about their position in OPEC, along with Brazilians, as the two self-sufficient countries on the bloc attracted other agendas, interests into mining their economies. So yeah, people came in and there were various things that corrupted the markets, including people wanting to just,
I don't understand
benefit.
what that means.
Panama take this stuff, right?
Yeah. Which part?
Mining the economies? What does that mean? Like,
so this is a metaphor that people are looking at the economy and saying, oh, there's a lot of wealth over there. We're going to come in and take it.
But
and
how do you take it?
You take over the companies and the companies already have a lot of profit, and you just take that money and leave the shelves of the companies, and they're not producing anything anymore, like stuff like that.
If you don't keep the company going, you just take the money.
Yeah.
You don't use off the assets. You don't reinvest any of the money.
You don't reinvest it. Yeah.
So you're just taking the profits and you're exporting the profits, and that's mining the company. Which is when people do that to a country, I think that's what he's talking about.
So parasitic, right?
Yeah. So someone else did all the work, and now they've got this machine in there that's producing profit, and you're like, oh, I want that profit-producing machine, but you don't really upkeep it or improve it.
Why would their incentives be different than the incentives of someone who owns a company and does reinvest?
Well, you've got to understand that the policies of the country change the incentives of everyone.
Right.
So it created So since there's no longer an incentive to create profitable business anymore, it's like, okay, well, how do I go in and
so you
get
can't trust that
there?
you're going to keep gaining the profits in the long term if you reinvest. So why even?
Yeah.
bother?
So why even bother?
Yeah.
But if something's producing, profit for you right now, you might as well take it, and that kind of thing. So there's less incentive to do what we would normally expect in a market economy of companies, producing more and then looking for profit.
The real reason that becomes a problem is because you are trying to trade their currency for other currencies at an accelerating rate.
With the inflation.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that causes inflation is because you're trying to get rid of that currency and get back to dollars or euros or whatever else.
But why are you doing that
that's certainly
before
part
the
of it,
inflation? Is that like once the inflation starts and then it accelerates it?
Well, it's one of the things that accelerates it to begin with.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a really important point. And ultimately, what it comes down to is people being able to spend their money on actual stuff. So if there's more money kind of floating around the economy and there's less stuff there because these countries are maybe producing less for the local economy, partly because they're not being reinvested in, and partly because all that stuff is being sold overseas, then you've got less productive capacity kind of for your local people in your economy. Yeah. Yeah, Julian.
The corporate bracket, I was going to say, when the rule of law is absent, there's no legal enforcement of the fiduciary duty to shareholders. So if you're an executive and you want to steal, you just steal. You don't worry about prosecutors.
Right. If you're in favor with the people in charge and you're not going to get in trouble, like that kind of thing. Yeah. So let's see.
I guess it really highlights the importance of other institutions to productive capacity too, right? Like every institution, legal institutions, all sorts of institutions are really critical.
Yeah. So I think they had all this inefficiency and kind of a drop in their productive capacity in terms of what could be produced for their people. And then the way the government tried to compensate for that was by saying, oh, people don't have enough stuff, everybody's poor, let's let's print money, let's raise the minimum wage, that kind of thing. So they spent more money into the economy, which of course uses up more resources, and especially if that money is not, if those resources are not being used efficiently, if they're, the resources that could be going to a bunch of people are going towards one person's, luxury car or something like that. And then if you're raising,
why would this make that happen? That doesn't seem.
I'm saying this is kind of in combination with the other stuff. So a government printing money on its own, or a government spending money, is not a problem, but it has to be going towards real resources. There have to be enough real resources that that there's actually something that the government's money is going to buy.
Right.
So in this case, they had less resources, and also all these other inefficiencies in the economy we were discussing from their various policies, and they're spending more money. So more money against less stuff equals inflation. And then hiking the minimum wage, I think if you want to get money to consumers, that's important. Your people need to be able to buy the things your economy is producing. But if you do that by hiking the minimum wage, then you're making it less profitable. Again, another thing that makes it less profitable for companies to hire labor or to do their business. So you're adding more inefficiencies into the market. So they responded to a drop in productive capacity by making their markets even less efficient in some ways, is what I would say happened here. I would say they should have eliminated the minimum wage and perhaps instituted a basic income, a very small basic income. And that's a more efficient way of.
Alex.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, David. Yeah.
What distinction do you make between a basic income and subsidies for basic needs? Because they do that. They continue to do that.
Yeah.
Not very well, mind you, because they're running out and they don't have enough of it to go around. But basic things there are subsidized by the government to be provided to people at a lower cost.
To everyone?
Yes. Well, everyone that is in line.
Go ahead, Richard.
When it happens.
In India, they're subsidizing like electricity and things, and the wealthy take advantage of that, and they bought tons of it, and then the poor are not able to. There isn't enough for the poor, so and there's all these middlemen trying to they give off the minimum amount to the poor, and they take a big piece of the profits for themselves.
That happens.
So to answer your question, David, the difference between a basic income and providing for basic necessities and stuff like that is that the basic income can be spent on anything, and it's fundamentally a tool for funding the market. So whatever people want, that's what they spend their money on, and it can actually help the markets allocate resources more efficiently. Whereas if you're paying for specific things, then you're forcing resources to go into certain places, and that's potentially less efficient.
That's very valid. I just wanted to make that distinction because when you're talking about absolutely the most basic needs of people, there isn't a huge distinction there between how they get things subsidized.
So I'm not talking about the absolute basic needs of people. I'm talking about the absolute basic needs of the market. Like, how do we get the market up and running? And then once you have the markets working, then the markets become more able to support people's basic needs.
Okay.
Now, there's certainly, even in a market economy, there's certain things for which it's more efficient for the government to pay for directly. I don't know that food is one of those things. I think food is something that if farmers know they can sell their food and make a profit, or that kind of thing, that's something the market can generally provide if people have the money to buy it. As for infrastructure and stuff like that, roads and bridges and hospitals, I would still say that the government should be spending for that stuff directly. But if your economy has less resources, maybe you don't have as good infrastructure. Maybe your hospitals have to be scaled down. Maybe
it seems like the key problem here is a lot different from the key problem that we would often talk about with the U.S., which is like you just don't even have the productive capacity. So your recommendations would be less focused on basic income in this case, and more focused on like everything that would get productive capacity off the ground.
Yeah, but I also I want to emphasize that it's hard to really let the markets work efficiently if you don't have a mechanism to get money into the hands of consumers. And if the mechanism you're trying to use is one that actually makes the markets less efficient, that's not going to help. But
I understand.
The basic income can help make it more efficient. Yeah.
Well, I think just what's more realistic, because I mean it's like if I'm thinking about the next 3 years,
Yeah.
I guess unless there's some sort of crazy revolution, if I'm thinking, okay, well, how do they get themselves out of this mess?
Right.
Yeah.
To me, it seems just, I don't know much, but opening up the economy
Yep.
and just giving it time. But then it's basically a political question because those people, Maduro and his guys, are in power. They don't want to give it up, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it seems that basically if we're thinking, how do they get themselves out of this mess, is just open up the economy so that things get real bad, but at least they're probably going to get maybe a little bit worse, but then they're going to gradually get better because the markets are going to take care of things.
I mean, there's been 3 ways that countries have successfully dealt with hyperinflation. It's opening the markets and giving things time, like a good amount of time, mind you. Like it's a lot longer than I think anybody really wants.
Right.
It's tooling up for war, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Like think Germany, 1930s, and then it's the Brazilian method, which is how they instituted the real in the 90s. They replaced another currency, so they actually. They basically psychologically got people to bring down inflation from hyperinflation to negligible inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And it was literally, they instituted like PR and, et cetera. And within a few years, they were able to fix their hyperinflation problem.
So
That's the
I
trust
think-
issue, but also you need to still open the markets up, right?
Well, they
You can't have
Right.
this minimum
it's not as
wage.
restricted anywhere near as that. But like the psychological impact
yeah.
of how
So-
people treat things is the biggest thing.
So I think that's the answer to inflation when your inflation is basically just built-in inflation, that the only reason you have it is because people expect it and just everyone keeps, increasing the prices. But in order for the Brazilian, thing to work, they had to fix the underlying problems, as Roma was saying. They had to do that first. And then you've still got some kind of leftover institutional inflation. And then you can say, okay, we're going to replace this inflating currency with a more stable
I mean,
currency.
maybe another
Yeah.
way to put it is like if you don't have the capacity to actually give people food and medical care, you don't have the capacity to give them food and medical care. Like even
Yeah.
if you somehow stabilized your currency, like that's not the only
Right.
issue that they're
Right.
dealing
No,
with.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
It just, and like historically, the only time that economies have increased their capacity by that much is for war. It's kind of
But how I don't see how
Like,
you would
this would be-
increase. You need the capacity for a war, though.
you build up your capacity and you focus.
Oh,
it.
like it's a motivation to build it
Yeah,
up?
like historically, there's never been an economy that's focused it any other way
So
when they're in this situation.
So I think countries do build capacity during a war, but I also think a very important thing that happens is they start utilizing their existing capacity that was maybe being underutilized before. So I think that's a large part of what happened, in the United States for World War II, is that we had all this stuff. We had a ton of capacity in the 1930s, but people didn't have the money to activate all those factories and that kind of thing. So war can activate capacity, and then once your capacity is active, of course, that creates now there's profit to be made in building more capacity because that capacity is going to be used. Or if it's a war thing, there's other incentives there as well.
But I guess I'm wondering, like, it seems like that wouldn't really help here because the capacity, like, building isn't really very available. Like, the institutions are so bad and so on that it's not like you could just get enough motivation going and then people could start producing stuff.
I think you got to get the markets working. I think you've got to open up the markets. That's the most fundamental thing. And then in order to activate the markets, you need a way for consumers to spend money. So that's kind of where basic income comes in. Now, in terms of the political realities of what's actually going to happen in the real world in Venezuela, I think Roma's probably right that a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is unrealistic. And I think it's probably pretty unrealistic that they're going to get out of this crisis anytime soon.
Well, they kind of have to get out of it, don't
Everybody's
they're
leaving.
just going to keep losing
Yeah.
people. And,
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of countries that have stayed really poor in really horrible conditions for long periods of time. Like Venezuela is a little bit new at this, but it's not, something that's unheard of. Yeah. But yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say you were suggesting like a small basic income to avoid the problems. It wouldn't be large to avoid the problem compounding hyperinflation.
Yeah, so I mean, the idea is you need to bring consumer spending down to the level that the economy can actually provide.
Because it can't handle. That's why you can
Yeah.
Right. And then you also, at the same time, want to remove some of the inefficiencies in the markets so that the economy can provide more for people. So you bring down the consumer spending, you bring up the efficiency of the markets and potentially build productive capacity. And then once you get there, the currency maybe it won't stabilize. Maybe you'll still have institutional built-in inflation in your country, and you'll have to pull a Brazil trick or something like that. But you can't do the Brazil thing until you've already fixed this other stuff.
But that's a way to like also get money to everyone, including the poorest people. But that doesn't like disincentivize companies from hiring people and that kind of thing.
Right,
so it kind
right.
of kills both.
Yeah, if you have no
helps
minimum wage, then and people want to work for really cheap, then that's a way of activating capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
you could think of that as like some of the labor is part of their productive capacity, and it's going to go unused with a minimum wage, and they really can't afford that maybe right now.
I read that there are a lot of people in Venezuela who actually make their money by being gold farmers on online games.
Oh yeah.
So what they do is they go on World of Warcraft or some other online game, and within the game they try to earn as much gold as possible within the game, and then they sell that gold on the internet for dollars. And they can make a lot more money doing that than they would be able to make at a regular job in Venezuela. Now, it might only add up to like $3 a day or something like that, but that's a lot in a country where you could only make a fraction of that at a job.
The average Venezuelan a few months ago made the equivalent of 50 cents in 2 days, I believe.
Yeah, so there you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, like, if this is the way that people make money, then you're not really able, to build your productive capacity because people are just playing video games.
Right.
But literally, that's the most profitable thing for them to be doing.
Right.
So.
Thanks, Hugo Chavez.
Yeah.
Although, like, as a shorter term, we're talking about like shorter term solutions. Like, certainly one way to open up the market is like if people do have labor that other people in the world want that you can connect like via technology. That's another good way for them to have basically more exports besides oil. And be a little bit more robust. Well, like I was thinking of like surveys. Like I don't think Amazon Turk is available in Venezuela. I don't know how many people speak English there, but like there's a lot of online sort of labor marketplaces where the money would go really far for people in Venezuela.
Yeah.
It would be like kind of mutually beneficial.
And I mean, if people can get dollars somehow on the internet, then they can import actual stuff.
Right.
Actual real stuff that the global economy can produce for them. I mean, it's tricky because there's a lot of restrictions and like you're not allowed to do that. But
you're not. I see.
No.
So I guess this was kind of Roma's point
are.
about like.
Well, yeah.
But this was part of my point.
problem.
Like this would be a version of opening up the markets too, like to allow people to sell their labor more freely to whoever would
Certainly.
want to.
Well, yeah.
If you had open markets and people could earn World of Warcraft gold and buy import stuff with it, then that's still a way of getting the economy going because now they're bringing real stuff into the economy and, potentially that could lead to more profitable non-video game ways of earning a profit, like more productive. Yeah.
Remember everyone.
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Well, since they're shipping off their people, they can pull Philippines and to have all these remittances coming back to their country. Or they can do like Ecuador has its currency pegged to the dollar, but they don't have any control over their currency since it's already completely pegged to the dollar. And so that could...
Ecuador had to do that. And Venezuela has just started to export. Like people have just started to leave there en masse. Remittances will come eventually.
What's
remittances? But remittances is money you send back to your home country when you leave it. Remittances will come eventually, but they're not allowing people to convert it to the local currency at a fair rate is really the issue. Mm-hmm. So you're not getting anything. Really, what the only thing that's helping them, like the common people, as far as that goes, is somebody would come to, let's say, the United States. They would live here, they would work here, and once a year they might fly home and they would bring a suitcase full of blue jeans.
Right.
And those blue jeans are worth so much in the market, like they're bartering at that point because they can't get a fair exchange rate regardless.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, if you let them use dollars directly, if you open that up, then that makes a huge difference right there because now they have a currency they can use.
Yeah, they mentioned there was like a black market for dollars basically, so a lot of that stuff is having to go like into the illegal channels.
So that makes it harder to implement a basic income, of course. But once your people are using a stable currency, you could now start a new domestic currency that, if you have a sane economy and you spend an amount of it that's consistent with what your economy can handle, you can start bootstrapping a new, more stable currency off the dollar if you wanted to. Yeah, go ahead, Roma.
So this is a new topic maybe discussed before. So I think it's been over a year since they've introduced their cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
I don't imagine that it took off anywhere. It was mentioned in the article because, again, there's no trust. So it doesn't matter if it's crypto, if it's regular currency, it's all the same stuff. But does anybody know?
Yeah, so they're very secretive about it. And my feeling is that if it were a success, they would be less secretive about it.
Yeah.
No
surprises.
So basically, they've introduced this digital currency. It's a cryptocurrency. It's called the Petro, and they say that it's pegged to oil.
We talked about that in the article. Yeah.
Now, the point of a currency, I mean, like, pegged to oil is better than something that has hyperinflation. But assuming they're even successfully doing that, which I don't think they are. But ultimately, you want your currency to be stable with respect to the goods that people buy, like the normal stuff, not oil, which fluctuates wildly and that kind of thing. So I think even the idea of having a currency pegged to oil is probably not the greatest concept.
I think they were banking on the fact that they have a lot of oil, so it would give people because again, big part of currency is confidence. So it's almost like this is the only thing we have going for us. Let's just peg it to oil in hopes that people will have confidence in this crypto.
And to be clear, oil isn't, oil can still be profitable, but I think, as Julian mentioned, their oil infrastructure is suffering from a lot of these inefficiencies too. And if they got that up and running, that could help. But I mean, that's part of the whole getting the markets working again.
Yeah, a lot of the reserves are a type of crude that is very expensive to refine, so it's not as economically advantageous as like the oil in Texas, for example.
I see.
Sweet crude, so they exported.
Sulfur is a big problem with it.
So no one's gonna buy it at a rate that makes it profitable unless the price of oil is higher.
Exactly.
Okay.
And interestingly, the only refineries that can really refine it are in the United States.
Yeah.
So, like, they
and
have
we have
to sell it
sanctions
to
against
us.
them. Yeah.
They effectively have to sell it to us, which is just a whole other problem.
Although other countries could build them, I guess it's just not worth it.
It's not worth it because it's so expensive to refine it.
Like, could this specific kind of oil?
Yeah.
Why is this more expensive to refine?
It's heavy in sulfur, is specifically, and there's a couple of other problems with it. You might know a little bit more about that than I do.
I think it's mainly the sulfur.
Yeah.
It's not only that.
Is that what you're
removing sulfur from oil is just like
right? And so that's what you were saying, Julian. Like, because of that refinery cost, unless the price of oil is high enough, it's not worth the trouble.
Exactly.
Basically,
As Alex said, the break-even price is very high.
Right.
For Russia, for example, much lower.
Interesting. Because of just the quality of the natural material. Yeah.
So I actually didn't know that. That makes a lot of sense. So it's not that they were exporting something that got cheaper. It's that they were exporting something that suddenly they couldn't export it anymore. It just wasn't possible.
Yeah, there's a non-linear relationship.
Exactly.
The price and the value to them.
Right.
Options.
It's like the tar sands in Canada.
Something similar.
Yeah.
Yes, very valuable when the price is high. But
the refining price for Venezuelan oil is like $40-something per barrel. So if oil is $60 per barrel, then they can only sell their oil for $20 per barrel, no matter how much it costs them to get out of the ground, basically.
Also the transportation, because the only place they can refine it is the Houston Ship Channel. So that's an expensive trip from southern Venezuela across the jungle.
Wow.
So I'm guessing it's still at a price where it's not profitable to export it, or
I would assume so.
I mean, I think it's technically profitable if they weren't so corrupt, but like it gets some dollars in, but they're not really getting money. Like they're not doing anything off of it. Like
they're subsidizing the loss essentially to get hard currency. That's what I would assume.
Yeah, I think that's my understanding. That's my understanding. Yeah. So again, nobody knows.
We were also asking about like Saudi Arabia and places like that. So this is a big difference.
Their oil costs like $10 to get out of the ground and refine, when Venezuelan oil costs $40-something.
Right. So that's a really big difference. Yeah. In addition to I presume Saudi Arabia's economy is more diversified and functioning better. I don't know. I was just curious because they're also a major oil company.
Saudi Arabia does a lot of weird things with their economy where they use that oil money to subsidize other industries to increase that capacity, so that they are technically diversified.
Right.
Though I mean, in theory, if the oil subsidy ever went away, those industries may not continue.
They might not survive. Yeah. I see. So it's hard to say whether they're brittle in a similar way.
Yeah, I mean
probably somewhat
with
less
their base price being $10 per barrel,
right.
It's the cheapest oil in the world to refine.
Right. So they're in a much better position.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
That's really interesting.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
And I would imagine that in terms of the restrictions they have on their economy, that even if some of this capacity that they built up wouldn't be as profitable without the oil subsidies, that it's not like Venezuela where they actually kind of killed their capacity and other things in response to the oil.
Yeah, I mean there are certain things that clearly they are killing off via the subsidy of oil. Like they just, in fact, are. It's like they subsidize oil so much that the cheapest way for them to get electricity is oil. And really, like if you think about where Saudi Arabia is and the fact that it's desert, solar power there would be relatively cheap for them at this point. And they're starting to go that way to some degree. But like, there's some trade-off that they're making. But again, their oil is so cheap that literally, if oil is worth anything, they're going to be okay.
So they'll see it coming like a lot further away.
Yeah. Like again, $10 or $12 per barrel, I believe, is the price for them to get out of the ground and refine it.
Yeah, and they can also afford to do things like if the price of oil gets too low, they can stop selling it and wait for it to come back up again. And they often do that kind of thing as well.
Right. And because
and
they're
they can
25% of the supply of the
Right.
world, they can control the world price that way.
Right. And this is a much smaller percentage of the world supply, right? So they're not.
Venezuela
has the largest proven reserves.
Right. It's the largest proven reserves at this price, and it's not going to be a very high percentage of the oil in the world.
Right.
And given the level of inefficiency in their economy.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I was driving at. It seems like as much as there might be inefficiencies in Saudi Arabia, like it's a worse situation here.
Yeah.
In terms of what they have to like fall back on in that temporary period, for example, if they're not selling oil.
Yeah.
I would assume that Saudi Arabia maintains very large reserves of all of the main reserve currencies.
They have a ton of dollars.
Dollars, euros,
euros, and that Venezuela, I would also assume, just can't afford because their currency is so weak to acquire those currencies.
Venezuela is out of dollars.
And it gives them, I mean, like I know Saudi Arabia does a lot of creative venture capital investing in the United States and other countries, basically funding risky projects that other investors without capital won't take on. But unfortunately for Venezuela, they don't have the ability to.
Did Venezuela just never get strong enough, even when the oil price was like financially, even when the oil price was higher, or is it more of the ideologies that prevented them?
Venezuela had a very, very strong economy in the 90s.
No, I mean once the new administration. Oh, so it was kind of the new administration.
The new administration killed it. Yeah.
They had a strong economy up until 2008 when the oil price crashed from like $100 and whatever dollars per barrel down to 40 or whatever it went down to. Like their economy was still strong when the oil price was very high. They had one of the highest standards of living in Latin America in around 2007.
Interesting.
But the economy had already become more brittle by that point, it was more dependent on the oil.
They were exporting oil and importing everything. But because the oil price was so high, they could do that.
Yeah. But why weren't they doing some of these financial investing things? That's part of what I'm curious about. Like when the economy was strong, or were they? Maybe?
I think they were investing in domestic social programs.
I see. Okay.
So if you were kind of like a member of the ruling political party, and given that they had a lot of revenue at the time, probably you could live well. But to Alex's point, there's this kind of brittleness embedded in that. And then when the price of oil dropped, that spending just couldn't be funded. But it was, to my understanding, domestic.
So was it kind of are we guessing it was kind of a lack of foresight not to invest in kind of other things like infrastructure or productive capacity?
One of the big things that they invested in was they trained a lot of doctors. They sent people all over the world to become doctors. Like they paid for education in foreign countries to import doctors basically to their country. So that they could provide better healthcare for their people, which is an admirable thing. But then the economy tanked and all those doctors left. They took their educations and went to whatever country they were trained in for the most part because their licenses could be reciprocated there.
Right.
And so right now, people don't have basic medical care there. And they won't let people go in to provide it is the other problem.
Why?
They won't let people go to Venezuela to provide basic medical care.
So that has changed like this week.
Really?
Like today, I saw an article in the Washington Post.
What was the reason for that before? Do you know?
Yeah.
They didn't want to admit that they needed help, basically. The government didn't want to.
The government was basically pretending there wasn't a problem. So this is from today, Washington Post. After years of crisis, Venezuela's Maduro might finally be ready to accept some help. So obviously there's a lot of qualifier words in there. Might finally be ready to accept some help.
So they weren't allowing in like humanitarian aid and stuff like that?
Yeah.
That's right.
They literally
Because by doing so, they would be admitting that there was a problem in their economy.
So a huge part of this problem is that the government is not looking out for the interests of the people. Is that kind of an objective enough statement?
Well, this is an ideological problem because with Chavez, the whole thing was that the West is out to get us and we need to focus on the poor. I'm simplifying it and I'm very ignorant about the details, but that's the gist of it.
What would be the argument? I guess what would the government say if they were to say, no, we're like looking out for the interests of the people by not allowing in this aid? Would it have something to do with like public views of the country?
I don't think they would frame it that way. I think they would say, we're looking out for the interests of the people and we don't need aid because everything's okay.
Okay, but given that they clearly did, then that piece seems like it's just not properly functioning as a government at that point. Or like, is there an argument to be made on the other side that I'm missing? With that particular piece, maybe just
they'd probably say these people are agents of the West, of America. And
so one of the things is like we send around like the USS Comfort we send it wherever we want to around the world, and it helps people like after the Haitian earthquake. It specifically tends to stay around Central America and the Caribbean, but like we have it parked just outside the border of Venezuela because they won't let us into Venezuela's waters to help people. So people are leaving Venezuela, going to Colombia, taking a boat out to the USS Comfort, which is parked at sea.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it's this weird rigmarole to help people, and it's crazy.
And that's
because
about
they don't want
the
to
westernization that they're against.
Ideological.
I mean, starting in 2010, Hugo Chavez, said they were at economic war with the United States, and the United States was trying to undermine their society and their government and their economy and everything. And I think Roma is right that the way they spin it to their citizens is that these offers of aid are really kind of U.S. infiltrators trying to undermine the economy and undermine their political system and that kind of thing.
Well, I don't know if anybody remembers they were actually TV ads back in the day, but in like 2010, Hugo Chavez was on TV ads for Chevron, because Chevron is the Venezuelan oil company, and they were basically going around advertising that they were providing free heating oil for people in need in the United States because it was their ideological war against the U.S. But we let them in because if you want to give our people free stuff in the United States, they generally say fine, go ahead.
Unless you're China selling us cheap.
Well, that's selling us cheap. Yeah.
That's selling though.
But if people want to give things to people in the United States, we're generally okay with that. But Hugo Chavez was on these TV ads saying, we, the generous, magnanimous, Venezuelan people, are giving these poor Americans who can't even afford to stay warm in the winter heating oil, and aren't we so generous, and like trying to win hearts and minds here, and they don't want us to reciprocate. Like they don't want that table turned on them. They fundamentally, just ideologically, do not want to admit that they failed.
Well, it's pride, right?
Yeah, it's pride,
which is understandable to some degree, but when it goes too far.
Right.
What I have a question here, which is a lot about Venezuela, but up until around the time Chavez got elected in sort of 2008, what was the level of inequality in the country? What was the overall distribution?
It was very high.
Yeah.
And Chavez got elected on a platform of reducing inequality, better social programs, alleviating poverty, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So there were impetuses to create these social programs. It wasn't initially, at least, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting because I don't know all the details of the differences, but Norway, for example, also does some things with using oil money for the public good and stuff like that. But there's so many differences I can't really know, but there's I think maybe a way to have a balance where you also have good productive capacity and maybe a way not to. I don't know if it was the fact that they had this one really attractive product, the oil or something,
right?
But yeah.
Norway does. They take half of their oil revenue and put it into a perpetual trust.
Right. They don't pay it out as cash.
I was going to say
No.
they save it.
Well, Alaska saves some of it too.
But I think they do invest in they invest in the roads are really fantastic, which brings in tourism. They invest in they have good healthcare and other social programs. But it's somehow not I don't think they have the kinds of disincentives to create a profitable company maybe that Venezuela does. So it's kind of maybe different models around the world of how you balance those concerns. Because Norway doesn't have a ton of inequality, I don't think either, but they're doing a lot better.
They have the least in the world.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to compare those two, two cases or something.
If they were smart, they would do this is what they would do. They'd do the Alaska model, right? That would probably be. I'm guessing that would be your suggestion to them.
Yeah, I mean, if I were Hugo Chavez in 1998. Instead of doing all this other stuff, or maybe not instead of all the other stuff, but certainly I would have implemented the basic income, not do anything with minimum wage. I wouldn't have put in price controls. I would have used proper monetary policy to try to keep my currency stable, that kind of stuff. Let the markets really reach their potential, but also if there's infrastructure that the government needs to centrally pay for it. Yeah, so a combination of those two things.
But they didn't know that the price of oil was going to come down to a level they couldn't sell theirs anymore.
They knew it was going to come. Reasonably, people there knew that the price was going to come down eventually. It goes up and down, and it's going up and down continuously over time. Nobody ever expected to hit $150 a barrel in 2008 or what. It was something along those lines. I don't remember the actual peak. I'm sorry.
I think the peak was actually in 2014, and then it came crashing down. Yeah, so it went down in 2008, but then it went up even higher, and then it came down again in 2014.
Whatever the peak was and whatever the trough was, people expected some of that.
Right, but it was super abrupt.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it was it fell by half overnight.
Yeah, and to be clear, Hugo Chavez wasn't he didn't come in and say, okay, we're going to transform this entire economy to be just about exporting oil. That wasn't his plan. That's kind of how it ended up. And
it was already super reliant on exporting oil, right?
In 1998, I think it was, but they had all kinds of other private businesses and stuff too. They were among, I think,
Major clothing was they exported a lot of clothing to the U.S. at the time.
Yeah.
They exported a lot of small widgets. I'm going to say screws and nails. Interestingly, is the thing that I know that now we get them from China mostly. But it's just there's a lot of other stuff they exported at the time.
Yeah. So they had oil, but they also had a lot of other industry. It was a more diversified economy.
It kind of seems like the oil let them not maybe notice it clearly that the other parts of the economy were. Or not have as many consequences for the fact that they were kind of disintegrating.
Yeah, the oil was so profitable that it created an incentive to just focus on the oil.
Right.
So this is what I was talking about. It's what economists call the Dutch disease. So in 1959, there was vast natural gas fields discovered under the Netherlands, and then the Netherlands, because they had such an advantage in natural gas, they specialized in exporting natural gas, and then a lot of their other industry kind of withered. So I would say that something similar happened in Venezuela, but it was really, I would say it was accelerated by the increasing price of oil, but it was also accelerated by all these market restrictions. So, you couldn't be profitable doing other things a lot of times. Yeah.
I guess what this makes me think of just as a general thing is the kind of foresight needed, like to run an economy so it's working now, but also so it's not super brittle, because you just never know if you're a really brittle economy, what's going to happen.
If you have a planned economy, the amount of foresight you need is unimaginable.
Well,
I would agree with Alex. That's the main problem.
Well,
the main problem is that they decided to vilify the free market.
Right, I understand.
Right.
Hold on,
And
let me
the
back
writing
up
was on
to
the wall for
I had a different point in mind. That's even
ahead.
assuming you have a free market economy. So for example, one of the things that we've talked about in this meeting is maybe there's a country that wants to sell you a ton of cheap stuff for whatever reason.
Right.
And then that may mean that you don't really have much incentive to make your own stuff. But you might want to maintain some kind of productive capacity anyway, even if you have a free market, because that country might realize oh, we don't want to do this anymore, or there might be some thing that you can't control. So there might be some resilience even in a free market economy that needs to be thought through a little bit at the government level.
I would say that if you're very narrowly dependent on imports for a specific thing in your economy, then it can make sense to
right, or with international
specific
politics or something, you don't want to be too reliant on one particular brittle thing.
Yeah, you can plan ahead by maintaining that kind of infrastructure, and that would be a centrally managed type thing, because the market isn't going to incentivize that on its own. But more generally speaking, I think if you have markets that are functioning properly, and then you do have some kind of economic shock that comes in,
they can kind of respond. Yeah.
Like something comes in and reduces your economy's capacity, and is the result is that it makes everyone poorer. You need to say, okay, everyone's poorer now. Mm-hmm. Everyone's going to have less money to spend. You don't instead keep giving them the same amount of money and allow inflation to happen, or give them even more money and end up in hyperinflation or something like that. You have to admit, okay, we're going to be poorer now.
Right.
Yeah.
So the fundamental thing here is, if oil is 10% of your economy and oil crashes,
Right.
your economy becomes 10% smaller.
Right.
If oil is 99% of your economy and oil crashes,
Right.
your economy becomes 99% smaller.
Right.
Like,
And if that does happen to you, the appropriate response is to say, okay, my economy is 99% smaller. People are going to have to make do with 99% less spending power.
Right.
Alex, what you described, in spite of the rhetoric, is what has happened in Russia throughout the past 10 years. Because they experienced the same thing, but effectively, in spite of all the rhetoric, that's what has happened. It's like
Can you say more about that?
They keep the currency stable.
Yeah, the currency is stable. The inflation is pretty low. The people have just become poorer.
Oh, so the productive capacity
spend
went
less.
down.
Right.
The government brainwashes them with ideas that the West is out to get us, but effectively everybody's just poorer.
Why
Well,
did
one
it?
of-
Why did it go
things
down?
keep going on.
And one of the things that they've been doing to help combat like the deflationary impact of all that is gearing up for war. Like, I mean, fundamentally, like it's one of the things that governments use to combat it. Like, hopefully Venezuela doesn't decide they want to invade Colombia, but you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Well, but again, I
So
would go back to. Oh, go
I
ahead.
just want to say, it sounds like, Russia is in a pretty bad spot, but they're better off than Venezuela. And the first step for Venezuela is probably getting to like where Russia is. Like that's the first step, admitting that they're poor, and then going from there.
one of the really interesting
Yeah,
things
go
that
ahead.
Russia started doing to counter it is they have all these open plains and they've been raising cattle to export to Europe.
Oh, there you go.
Like they're like, well, we can't export oil for the same price,
Right.
but people will still eat this cattle, and it's a thing. Like we just have this grass growing, so.
Right. So they're investing in different productive
Yeah,
capacity.
I mean,
to compensate.
I'm not saying they're doing a great job of it. There's a lot of other problems there, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera.
Right.
But they are trying to push different diversification in their own economy also.
Is oil this? Is it the same reason in Russia, like the oil prices going down, are affecting? Is that what's driving?
Oh
it?
yeah, it was a
Yeah.
humongous crash. The currency lost
Right.
half the value.
Right. Right.
Does Russia actively manage the ruble against the dollar and the euro?
Not well.
I don't think so. No,
They do try to push it around a little bit because they do have some foreign reserves, but like very minimally.
Yeah, and they probably do it
Yeah.
for the purpose of keeping prices stable within their domestic economy, for the most part. So there's different ways to think about currency stabilization. You can either be like keeping it stable relative to another foreign currency, or you can be keeping it stable within your economy so that the people living there, prices are predictable in their everyday lives and that kind of thing. And the two don't exactly line up with each other.
I've sort of general, not a kind of general question that comes up a lot is this idea of currency reserves. What exactly are they, and how do they get created? I mean, they're just amounts of cash that you accumulate over time that you can then use to. How does that work exactly?
Yeah. So if you want your currency to remain stable against the dollar, for example, and suddenly your currency is starting to get more valuable, what you do is you sell your currency and you buy dollars, and then you accumulate a reserve of dollars. And if things are going the other direction, then you start selling your currency, or you start buying your currency and selling some of the dollars you accumulated in your reserves. And that just, in the currency trading market, you basically participate in the foreign exchange currency trading markets to push the price to where you want it by buying and selling your own currency in terms of the other currencies.
So you'd have like in your the central bank or something would have like a account that has. Like it's actually in, like, if you're in a foreign country, it'd be in dollars.
Yeah, dollars and
every,
euros. Yeah,
every,
you can do that.
Every central bank has an account with every other central bank, effectively.
Yeah.
Like we have one with the Eurozone and China and the Japanese central bank and the British central bank, and etc. And we just they are constantly like making these little trades back and forth.
Right.
Yeah.
But so electronically in some ledger, there's like in the federal, the Reserve Bank here, there's like some euro sitting in some.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and just to make a point real quick, the Chinese specifically don't tend to leave it in the central bank accounts. They tend to use it to buy bonds in the currencies, either Eurozone bonds or U.S. bonds or Japanese bonds. Tend to be what they buy, and they'll trade other currencies for those three currencies.
Yeah.
But then they buy the equivalent of U.S. Treasuries in different regions.
And a lot of central banks do that too.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when you're talking about dollar reserves, those reserves are not just in straight up dollars. They could be treasury securities, that kind of thing. Yeah. Saudi Arabia has a ton of U.S. Treasury debt.
Until 10 years ago, Saudi Arabia had the most U.S. Treasury debt. Now China does.
Now China does. Yeah. So yeah. Has anyone been holding in any thoughts? Okay. I've got this highlighted here. So we talked about how they kind of replaced their old currency with a new currency by just lopping off a bunch of zeros. Probably not going to be that effective in stemming inflation.
You're not
And
gonna
in
be
fact,
happy with any of these. I
this
can already
this
tell.
is an old article, so this has already happened, and surprise, it wasn't effective.
The
Now-
fatherland ID, that sounds kind of scary.
Yeah. So let me.
1984.
So
This is 1984.
Yeah.
yeah. So like I was saying before, you can't really introduce a new currency and hope it's going to be stable without fixing some of the underlying problems in the economy. So they're trying to do that. They think they're doing that with these ideas. So let me read this. The new currency is part of an economic package, in quotes. I don't know why that's in quotes. An economic package of measures which the government says is the magic formula to help Venezuela's battered economy recover. Among the measures are raising the minimum wage to 34 times its previous level from starting on September 1st, so that's a few months ago. Obviously, this makes it harder to allocate labor in your economy. It makes it harder to use that resource. So I would say this is potentially going to negatively impact your economy's productive capacity and make inflation worse. So I don't know if this was even designed as a measure to help inflation, more as a measure to
Money to people.
to get money to people and to maybe kind of compensate for the inflation that's already happening or something like that. But certainly doing something like this is only going to push inflation further. And then the second one is what we talked about with the virtual currency. They say it's linked to the Venezuela's oil reserves. I mean, fundamentally, if your economy has the resources to back the spending in the economy, then it has those resources. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't. Declaring that your currency is backed by oil reserves that you can't even really sell anymore is not really going to help unless the world economy somehow believes that they're going to have to be, they're going to they're planning to pay for this oil in the future, or like when the price of oil goes up, they have a deal with Venezuela or something like that. Maybe there's some of that going on, but this is not. I don't see how this can really help. Curbing Venezuela's. So actually, I don't disagree with all of these. Curbing Venezuela's generous fuel subsidies for those not in possession of a fatherland ID. I would say eliminate all the subsidies. You can't afford to subsidize fuel right now. This is not going to help the market be efficient. It's just going to help. A few people potentially benefit if they can even find the fuel, if there isn't a fuel shortage, that kind of thing. And the last one, of course, is really a killer. Raising the VAT by 4% to 16%. So I would say...
What are they even taxing in the first place?
That toilet
That's a
paper.
good question.
Yeah, that one. They're taxing the printer for the currency.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So this is exactly the opposite of what you need to do. A VAT is a tax on production. If you want to boost your economy's production, you want to eliminate the VAT, and that will actually allow. By eliminating the VAT, it allows the government to spend more money because, well, to the extent that they can spend any money, it allows the economy to produce more. It means there's more resources for that spending to go after. So the VAT actually doesn't help the government spend more money. It reduces the amount of money that the government can spend. And that's kind of always true because it reduces the production in your economy by disincentivizing it. So I would say that these things are not going to help other than curbing subsidies.
What's the fatherland ID?
Probably the equivalent of like a driver's license.
Like, I'm wondering how many people actually have that.
It sounds like something you get only if you support the government.
Well, that's what I'm wondering.
No,
Yeah.
it's probably a state ID, but the real issue with the generous fuel subsidy there is people come over the border from other countries and neighbor them and buy fuel for, I think it's like
I
20
see.
cents a gallon or something like that, and in
Right.
other countries nearby it's $3 a gallon.
Right. So that seems pretty sensible, actually, if they want more resources for their own citizens.
So they potentially
Yeah.
only want it for citizens rather than
Right.
I mean, they could only issue it to people who are members of the party. I wouldn't be entirely surprised, but I wouldn't assume
I was
that. I'm
mostly
assuming
just
it's to
curious,
curb the Colombians specifically coming in.
Interesting.
They export a lot.
Well, it's not. So the president said that all Venezuelans who hold the fatherland ID, a government-issued identity card introduced by his administration in 2017, will continue to receive direct subsidies for about 2 years. However, many Venezuelans opposed to Maduro's government have refused to get the ID cards, alleging that they are used by officials to keep tabs on them. So yeah.
So this is not a trivial point. One thing, the article did mention the human cost a little bit, but so I had a roommate who's from Venezuela. So one thing that the article doesn't convey is the actual human cost of this. Like it's dangerous there.
Yeah.
Like it's like straight up. The probability of getting mugged or assassinated or kidnapped is, I don't know what the number is, but like it's extreme.
Right.
Like if you're out on the street.
Yeah.
He said that people don't assemble in public places anymore.
Wow.
They only go to it's crazy how all of these ideological decisions that took place somewhere up in Hugo Chavez's echelon have had just a crazy cost.
Yeah. So that's not to diminish the human cost at all, and I don't mean to, but for our discussion, like we haven't really talked about that in terms of trying to get production off the ground. Obviously, if you can't assemble, you can't really start a
because
company
I mean it's dangerous because there are a lot of criminal activity has been criminals who are on the side of the government, they feel like they're vigilantes.
Right.
And it's not like people aren't pushing, like you may ask, again, I don't know much, but from my roommate, it's not like everybody's leaving.
Right.
Right? Some people are like, no, we're going to fight this, but there's enough clout from the people who do support the government that it's not that easy. Like they have riots all the time. I haven't been following this, but like it's extreme.
The official murder rate is comparable to narco states.
Right.
Like, and that's the official murder rate. Like,
they have one of the highest murder rates in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I presume this wasn't true in the 1990s before.
No.
This happened. Yeah.
No, not at all. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So, meanwhile, shoppers still face empty shelves in supermarkets, and in some cities there have been water shortages and power cuts caused by lack of investment in Venezuela's crumbling infrastructure.
Why is it? I'm curious because like it's a socialist country. So is this lack of investment in the infrastructure just since the oil crash? Is that what's been happening, or like was that also not something that they were investing in before?
I mean, it depends what type of infrastructure we're talking about.
I guess power and water in this case, or roads, or the police.
My guess is that they kept up the power and the water and the roads
just fine until the crash.
Just fine until then. Yeah.
Barely, probably. I mean, I imagine that they did the minimum. It's kind of like the MBTA.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, you face empty shelves. You gotta give people less money so that the people who actually go in are the ones who have the money to buy it. And I mean, you're still gonna have less stuff, but at least you get the market going again, and you create an incentive for people to put more stuff on shelves because they can sell it. I mean, yeah. I guess I've already said all this stuff. I don't know. Yeah, so I have a couple more quotes we can look at. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Yeah, Roma.
This is not necessarily a question, but given all of these problems, I think there is probably in the U.S. and in other countries this tendency to think, all right, let's go help them topple the government, right? But that's probably not a good idea. But I don't know if you know of any initiatives like that, right? Because problems are real. My opinion is that it's up to the people themselves to help themselves, because foreign intervention usually makes things worse. But I'm curious what the current state of those initiatives are around the world.
Well, I don't know, what our secret intelligence operations are in Venezuela, but I do know that we have sanctions against them. So,
export restrictions, I think.
Yeah. So
Why?
that certainly interferes because we don't like their government.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So for the reason that Roma said.
Because we think like we want the government to fail, and then the people look at a new government.
We want the government either to fail or to fall in line and become a more well-functioning market economy.
Why do we care that much about that? I mean, are we doing it out of altruism, or like is there a reason?
That's debatable.
I mean, it's a combination of we hate communists.
Right.
But there's lots of.
Really.
But then why do we hate communists?
Well,
Because
But we don't do this with every communist.
Yeah, we don't do it with China.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't do it with
Well,
China.
we do have trade restrictions with China. Like they're not just the tariffs, but we do have some trade restrictions where we won't let certain technologies go there, and et cetera, et cetera.
The United States, I guess, so now for the past 20 years has had kind of an antagonistic foreign policy relationship with Venezuela. So
Okay,
I
interesting.
would view these
I think
sanctions
I
as
remember
Yeah.
there was something back in the late 90s, early 2000s. There was a lot of speculation about the CIA having some involvement in like trying to push the elections one way or the other.
Yeah.
And that's always sort of thing rubs any country the wrong way.
And it's not unheard of in
What?
Latin America,
The
right?
other thing that people
Yeah.
forget is the Colombian oil company used to be publicly traded,
Mhm.
and they took it over. Just like, I mean, Saudi Arabia did the same thing back in like the 50s,
Yeah.
but like fundamentally they haven't operated as a free market, and the U.S.'s policy is always to grow the worldwide free market.
You mean the Venezuelan oil company?
Yeah, the Venezuela. Yeah, I mean, Saudi Arabia also did the same thing. It used to be
Yeah.
ExxonMobil owned the Saudi oil company, and they said nope, it's ours now.
Right.
Back in the 50s.
Yeah. But that's why they wouldn't invest in it, but not necessarily why they wouldn't accept exports. It's kind of a different thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't want their economy to be okay because we don't like their policies because they do stuff like that in free markets. Like, it's kind of
Right. So yeah, beyond that, I don't know, but I would, like, we don't like that they mess with free markets, but by sanctioning them, we're hurting free markets
Right, that's
even
also
more.
not a free market thing, so I was confused
So
about that.
I would say that we probably shouldn't be doing that, and the way to help would be to send them money, to send them dollars they could spend and buy stuff with.
Or to like allow people in too.
Well, it's
Yeah,
also
allow,
an ideological thing. I think
allow
just
them
today
all to
I
come
saw
here.
Putin sent a bomber to Venezuela.
Oh, what now?
A bomber.
Like a
bomber.
Plane
Like for them
with
to
bombs.
use?
No, just to base there. I just
Oh,
was
okay.
reading it on the
Like
radio.
for the Venezuelans to use, or
No, just as a sign.
To
Well,
show
because Venezuela
military,
and Russia are
yeah.
in good, like they're
Oh, they're
ideologically-
allies?
Yeah.
Yeah.
so-
Yeah, kind of like how we have military bases in
All over
various
the place,
countries,
yeah.
and yeah. That's
so wait,
interesting.
is Russia sending a lot of aid then? Will they accept it from Russia?
I don't know.
they do accept it from China. I know
They
that
do?
for a fact.
Oh, okay.
They accept limited aid from China.
Yeah.
But I don't. Yeah.
I think tried to keep them at an arm's length distance more recently. The Chinese and the Russians. I know Maduro was in Russia requesting more aid and
Right.
already been successful. It was unclear what he was offering.
What about the UN? Do they allow aid from the UN? Because that's that's international.
They
so-
allow humanitarian.
So right now, this is happening. Within the past 2 weeks, this is a different article. This is from today. Within the past 2 weeks, the United Nations announced that it would funnel $9.2 million to Venezuela from its Central Emergency Response Fund for the first time. A sum the Venezuelan government had agreed would go to UN agencies in Venezuela. Maduro also invited former Chilean President Michelle Bachelet, I don't know, head of the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit the country. The invitation came after refusing entry to the previous commissioner this year. So they're doing stuff. The country's secretive central bank, which had refused to share financial information for the past 2 years, is also reportedly preparing new data for the International Monetary Fund. So maybe stuff is happening now.
Right.
Yeah.
So in terms of the basic income angle,
Yeah.
So how? I mean, it doesn't sound like, as you people point out, it's not very politically likely in the short term.
No.
Is there any other similar countries in similar situations done anything remotely like introducing a basic income?
Iran.
Iran had a basic income from 2012, basically a basic income from 2012 to 2016. Is that
Oh,
correct?
really?
Yeah, but they weren't in a similar situation to Venezuela. Really, they were.
Because of the Arab Spring sort of thing.
Yeah,
Trying to quell rebellion.
yeah. So it was they really had kind of a basic income for those years, and it was very, very unpopular for people.
Really?
And then they ended it.
Why would it be unpopular?
No, it was very popular, but then they ended it because they
Oh, I
couldn't
thought it-
afford it anymore.
I thought it was unpopular.
It was unpopular with. Iran is a very conservative country, like socially and financially. A lot of people there. My understanding is it lagged in polls, and the president who supported it got elected out of office.
Right.
So, I mean, if you base it purely on who was winning elections, whether those elections are fair and free and all that other stuff is a whole other debacle in Iran. But the fact that the person instituted was elected out means their party was
the
elected
policy,
out.
right?
Yeah.
The policy
But
went with
did
them.
it seem to have the intended effect to some degree, or was it?
I think maybe to some degree, but people weren't necessarily that aware of it. And they were aware of the fact that people were getting money they didn't earn. And that was really upsetting to a lot of people.
What share? Do you know what share of the median income it was?
I really don't
Okay.
have all the statistics. We can-
Alright.
do you know, David?
I don't know.
Alex, I think for me, like,
Yeah.
one of the connections to basic income is, well, there's a few, but like a lot of people, when Alex talks about what he would want to do, say in the United States, they say like, isn't that just going to create what happened in Venezuela? So it's like thinking about what actually does put the limitation on the amount of money that you can give to people, or like the amount of basic income that you can give to people. Like
Right.
a lot of the time we suspect that we're dealing with untapped economic potential, like untapped productive capacity, that if you just gave people the money, that would actually do a lot.
Yeah.
But this is like one of these case studies where that's probably not the only problem, right? In fact, it's
Yeah.
not the major problem. The major problem is that the productive capacity isn't actually there.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting contrast. Like there is a limit to just giving people a lot of basic income that's actually doing anything, right? That's
Yeah.
inflation.
So I guess
Yeah.
in a way this is like the extreme case, right?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
seems that way.
Right. So,
yeah.
like where basic income is going to only have a small effect, and if you did it, you want to do it on a small scale. And
Yeah, you wouldn't
that-
really be able to afford a
Yeah.
ton of it, right?
Yeah, because until you get to the point where you can really do it on
Yeah.
a larger scale,
Right.
you need to have a functioning market first.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Oh, but
mean,
but they
unless-
go hand in hand, right? Like
Yeah.
if you have a basic income, that can allow the markets to start to function better as well.
Right.
Right.
But yeah, people tell me, oh, you want to print money, you can't do that. That causes hyperinflation. Look at what happened in Venezuela.
Yeah.
But
Right.
the reality, I mean, printing money is just government spending, and all governments spend. And some of them are fine, and some of them are not, like Venezuela. And the constraint on government spending has to do with like what your economy can do. And Venezuela's economy can't do very much right now. So that limits the amount of government spending they can
Do to fix the problem.
yeah, and what they've done is they've gone in the opposite direction. Instead of decreasing government spending when their economy was becoming less
shock,
productive,
yeah.
they increased it to try to compensate for it, but that's not going to work.
And they
And-
did specific things that hurt the capacity even more.
Right,
Yeah.
inefficiencies in the markets and just like the corruption and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think a basic income would help, Venezuela get their markets back working again, and especially if people say like, okay, we need to remove all these other kind of restrictions, but we have to be realistic and say like it's still a very small economy.
Right.
People are going to be pretty poor, but at least there's going to be a way for people, like a path for people to like earn money and compete in the markets and stuff like that.
So just really quick to answer your question, when it was introduced, the Iranian basic income, it was 29% of the average household income.
Okay.
And by the end of the program, it was about 25%. It stayed about the same at about the equivalent of US dollar $150 per person per day
Okay.
throughout that period. So the average person there was apparently making about $5 a day.
Okay. Cool.
And they got $150 as their basic income.
Sounds like not a bad start for a basic income. Just too bad it failed.
I think one thing here too, like, is that it seems like a basic income is one way to distribute money to everyone, including the poorest people, without distorting the markets in any way.
Right.
Which I think that like a tool like that isn't always psychologically available to like people who are trying to solve these problems. So like you're feeling, people are really poor, they need money, so you do things like minimum wage or like subsidies and stuff. But
Price
all of
controls,
those might price controls, but they also might be like actually hurting your big productive capacity in the long term. And if basic income's not doing that, so it's like this option for giving people money to spend on food that doesn't hurt the productive capacity. And that's, I think, a really interesting connection of basic income to like a problem like this is like, how do you not make things worse in the long run, but still like somehow give people at least some money and that kind of thing.
The other thing about it is, at the end of the day, even if you do increase prices by doing something like that to some degree, like even if you have some minimal impact on prices, fundamentally, because you're talking about a fraction of the entire economy, you're not talking about replacing 100% of income, like you're just adding some slack. You're adding, like, there's some addition and some inflation cause, and how much, where that falls on that scale is not 100% at either end, but it's somewhere
So I mean, I think what you're saying is right, that it's not the end of the world to have a little bit of inflation. But I would also push back and say that you can prevent inflation absolutely if you have proper monetary policy to reduce the amount of consumer spending and your basic income isn't beyond the level that the economy can sustain.
You could, in theory, come up with a perfect system where it would have, 100% swing one way or the other, either perfectly awful or perfectly wonderful. But what I'm saying is, the government, you can't expect the government to be all-knowing in such a way that they could design a perfect system where it would have no impact on inflation. Absolutely zero.
You can, so no government's economic policy is going to be perfect, but one thing that we are pretty good at, that central banks can be pretty good at, is keeping prices stable. I think that's something we can do.
Well, yeah. But they do that by raising interest rates, which is a different kind of inflation.
I would not characterize raising interest rates as a kind of inflation. I would say raising interest rates reduces the amount of borrowing in the private financial sector, and thereby reduces the amount of spending that's being funded through the private financial sector.
So, I'm sorry. My point is, when you inflate the cost of one thing, you can counter it with other pushing that cost somewhere else. And so, what you're saying is, you're by what you're talking about is affecting where inflation goes, not the fact that there is inflation.
But that's not the traditional way. I think
you understand what I'm saying?
I think you're saying that you put inflation in interest rates, right? Because you're raising the interest rates.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
When I talk about inflation, I'm talking about like everyday prices of consumer goods.
But that's it is you're talking about consumer prices,
right?
But business prices, cost of doing business to borrow money, or even the consumer price to borrow money to like buy a house, like that is affected by inflation, which is affected by interest. Like these go in hand.
So I mean, I think that's right, but I think for
like you'd have to.
So it makes it harder for businesses to borrow. It makes it more expensive for businesses to borrow. And people, yes.
Yeah. So in that respect, you have raised inflation, not our traditional.
You've raised certain prices in the economy. The price of borrowing money,
yeah.
And the price of doing business.
And you're going to lower certain prices by doing that, also because people won't be able to. Like, if you can only afford so much of a house, then the housing prices might fall.
And it also causes it could cause businesses to go out of business, and then they hire fewer people, and ultimately, what you need in the economy, what we care about ultimately is consumer prices. What you need is a mechanism to get money to consumers. And if you're influencing, anything that gets money to consumers, that affects consumer prices. But if you're influencing productive capacity, like maybe if businesses can't borrow as much, they go out of business and they stop producing, that could impact the productive capacity and cause inflation of consumer prices.
Right.
But
what I'm saying is like these are two opposing levers to some degree, and I'm not saying that they're completely imbalance. It's not a seesaw, but like you have to pull one lever a little bit and the other lever a little bit, and you can't have them both being pulled at the same time.
Yeah, if you increase the basic income and you want to keep prices stable, you want to also increase interest rates. I agree with that.
Or you're going to have to accept some inflation in more consumer prices or some other.
Right, I'm saying if you don't want inflation of consumer prices, you're going to have to raise interest rates.
But
you maybe.
Yeah.
What about like if you have a lot of untapped? It's the 1930s and you have a lot of untapped productive capacity that you have from the 1920s. Like, would you have to change interest rates, or wouldn't you just give the people more money and then?
Well, it depends. If you have right, so if you're activating untapped productive capacity and the amount of production is just increasing commensurately with the increase in consumer spending, then you don't have inflation. And the extent to which like even if you're not at productive capacity and you increase consumer spending, it's hard to say whether actual levels of production will increase exactly at the same rate you're increasing consumer spending. So you may have to raise interest rates or lower interest rates depending on.
So it helps to it helps smooth out the process too, because you can do it pretty quickly.
Well, you can't lower interest rates when they're too low. Like we hit zero interest rates.
You can't lower interest rates when they're at zero.
I mean, you
sort of can. But
we've had negative interest rates, but that's a whole other thing. Or we haven't. The Euros have. So my thing, Alex, is not to like say that you're wrong. My thing here is to say that I don't think that the government could come, or any individual person, or any computer that we've devised yet as human beings could come up with a situation that would perfectly balance these things and give you the exact amount of basic income you could give someone without having some of these other negative impacts. I think that number exists.
I don't think you could calculate it ahead of time.
Yeah.
But certainly if you start with a very small basic income and just keep prices stable as you're ramping it up, then we can kind of discover roughly what that level is.
I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying, like, it's still going to have an impact on the greater economy, and there is this shifting of inflation that exists, even if it's not in consumer prices.
Yeah, when I talk about inflation, I'm only talking about consumer prices. Yeah.
I mean, there's a flaw to that.
Well, the economy exists for the benefit of the consumers, right? So if other people's prices are going up, unless that has an impact on consumer prices, it's not a problem.
Well, to some degree, it will have to at some point.
Well, it depends. It depends on a lot of factors, right? So, I mean, like, if you can tell me a story about the mechanisms that would cause consumer prices to change, then, that's something I'd be more interested in.
Well, you can look at it, like, there are clear examples of that in history where if interest rates go up, then businesses' borrowing costs go up, so that to invest to keep consumer prices down, in theory, or to otherwise gain efficiency, and that has an impact on consumer prices. Or even if you're a business with $1 billion outstanding and you need to borrow $1 billion every year on that debt just to keep the wheels turning, if your cost goes up dramatically, then you need to raise your prices to service that debt. So you already have that.
So if you even can raise it, so if there are other people who are competing with you that don't need to raise their prices, then you just go out of business.
Yeah, and then prices go up because there's less capacity.
Well, it depends, right? Having less capacity doesn't necessarily mean prices are going to go up. That they're only going to go up if we're already producing at the capacity of the economy, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, like, for the United States economy, I would say that we have way too much investment for the amount of stuff we're producing. And a lot of that investment is being wasted, and it's going into stuff that's not ultimately producing stuff for consumers, or investing in stuff that's going to build capacity to produce stuff for consumers. So the way we reduce that is by raising interest rates. So if the amount of stuff we're producing is constrained by consumer spending, we can use a basic income to boost consumer spending, and then we can raise interest rates to lower the to put some of these kind of zombie corporations out of business. Yeah.
The real question I have here that I don't know if you really addressed is, the United States has one of the most consumer-driven economies in the world. Our consumers already drive 70-some-odd% of the U.S. economy. Other countries, it's much less.
What do you mean it's less? Like, what's driving it?
Yeah, I mean, consumers aren't 70% of a lot of other economies.
But what's the alternative? Like, what else is going on?
Government spending and then business to business.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, all of that other stuff exists ultimately exists for the benefit of the people. So I mean, the other economies might have more business to business stuff. Maybe that's more efficient, or maybe that's less efficient. What matters is ultimately the consumer.
I also think, like, it's not so much about what that percentage is, for Alex's point. It's just like, is there untapped capacity to produce things for the consumers that they're not having the money to buy? It could be you also would want to increase government spending, and so maybe the percentage would even be like more towards government spending.
Is there a metric for this, Alex? Like it seems a bit ephemeral
for untapped productive capacity.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know if there's a specific metric for it, but I would say that if your politicians are talking about creating jobs for people, and you have policies that are designed to create jobs as a way of funneling people incomes, and you have policies that are designed to increase wages as a way of funneling people incomes.
To get people.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that it would be good in order to compare other countries.
Yeah.
There's two real metrics that people use for untapped capacity. It's labor statistics, which are like hours worked per week per person.
Right.
And then there's.
So I just want to say about that one, I think that measure is completely bogus. Because it's possible to have way more people working than is necessary for the level of output that we have in our economy. And that's kind of where I would say we are. Anyway, continue. What's the other one?
But there's labor capacity there, which could produce more output than we want or need. I'm just saying it exists.
Right.
And then there's normally people look at raw material prices or inputs. and see what those prices are. And generally speaking, where if we can increase the capacity of a raw material and the price is low, then that's considered to be underutilized material.
Yeah. Say it again.
So, let's say corn prices go way down. That's a raw material. It's a raw input into other factors of the economy. If corn prices are really low and people aren't planting corn and those fields are going fallow, then effectively what you're saying there is there's excess capacity. Right. So people look at different raw inputs also to get that. I've never seen a study that really examined it. I don't know if you've ever come across anything, but that's one of the that and labor kind of the two.
So they'll compare the current prices to the historic average.
Yeah. And I think generally it's all about looking at prices, and I think interest rates too. If interest rates are at zero, kind of like we were for a while, then there's room for interest rates to increase more. And I would say we potentially have room for interest rates to even be higher today. Now,
the average heat bill rate over the last 50 years has been 5%. It's at
right.
2-3% now.
This is more.
So if there's room for interest rates to be higher, there's room for a basic income. Now, the fact that there's room for a basic income doesn't necessarily mean that there's unused productive capacity in the economy. It could just mean that we're shifting some of the spending from spending that's being funded by the private financial sector to spending that's being funded by the basic income, by consumer spending directly.
Which could have its own advantages too. But.
And I just want to say, back to the basic income causing inflation question. Even if you overshoot the basic income, if it's too high, if you just keep that flat level of basic income, each level of basic income is going to be associated with a particular price level. So if you just wait,
it won't run away.
The price level is going to stay wherever it is, whatever that basic income is, if you allow the market to be efficient.
I totally agree. So I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Right. So the trick is we look at our price level now. How do we roll out a basic income? How do we pick the right level of basic income that keeps the price level where it is as we remove some of the inefficiencies in the market and fund consumer spending and that kind of thing? We might not get it exactly right, but in the end, whatever your level of basic income is, as long as you allow the markets to be efficient, they'll equilibrate to a certain price level.
But
you've got to do it sort of incrementally and keep adjusting over time.
Yeah.
But not so fast that psychologically people get used to it at a certain level. That's going to have to factor into it.
Well, if it's too high and people get used to it being that high, what you're really going to have is you're going to have inflation until it gets to whatever level that is, and then that's the sustainable level.
But what about so imagine you're at that equilibrium, but you continue to develop new technology or have growing productive capacity. How do you know or guess kind of when to raise it? That seems like a difficult.
Well, that's what the open market operations do every day.
But how would it decide how to how would you know when to raise the basic? Or I'm not.
So if your interest rates start getting too low again, then you can start raising your basic income.
Is that kind of what you were saying?
Yeah.
Or consumer prices start falling too rapidly.
Well, we're assuming the central bank is keeping consumer prices stable using interest rates.
Okay,
so what you'd end up seeing is interest rates getting too low, and maybe you'd see too many asset bubbles and an expansion of credit that's maybe unsustainable, in the 2008 crisis, that kind of thing.
Sorry, I'm not trying to get you to commit to anything right now, but just for my own clarity, what you're suggesting is, let's say that we think that the ideal basic income is somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 per person. Let's just say, in theory, that's what we're talking about as a number. What you're saying is, okay, let's start with a number like $3,000, just in case we're wildly off.
And see per year.
Let's say per year, and I'm just picking arbitrary numbers, but real-ish arbitrary numbers. You say $3,000. Let's start with that. See what happens. Just make sure we're not wildly off.
Yeah.
And maybe has no impact on prices, has no impact on interest, ideally, and everything goes along hunky-dory, and you say, okay, let's make it $4,000, still no impact on prices, still no impact on interest. You increase it incrementally, maybe slowing down at some point, you're at $7,500, you're like, okay, guys, we think it's about $8,000 now, and really the exact right number was $7,937.82 per person, and you make it $8,000, you're going to get a tiny amount of inflation. And that's okay, because then everything will be adjusted to being $8,000, and there's no issue going forward.
Right, you get a tiny amount of inflation, and then the inflation will stop.
Yeah.
Once the prices have equilibrated to the level of the basic income.
Yeah. I'm just trying to, for my own clarity, trying to make sure I had that down.
People done models of it? Mathematical models? Or?
Yeah, I do them all the time in here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I'd really like to see.
I'd love to see that. That would be really cool.
Aren't they going to be in your
Well-
new paper? Little
Well, in
diagrams?
Iran, I mean, I'm sure somebody has done papers on Iran. That's a great
That
question.
would be
I think the
interesting,
the Iran program would be a good discussion topic for this group.
yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
But by the way, I love how you outlined the progression of the actual steps. The point is that the money would go to everybody in the economy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That $3,000 would go to whatever adult.
Right.
I'm not trying to get you to commit any numbers. I don't think anybody should say they have done anything to figure it out. But like in theory,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
you start somewhere conservative and then you gradually increase.
Yeah, that's
What's
true.
Andrew Yang's number? I know he calls it the
12,000.
12,000 a year.
12,000, so
Yeah.
1,000 a month.
Yeah. Yep. And he's also instituting a VAT, which makes it harder to pay for. But
Alex, can you
Sales
talk
tax
about?
VATs.
I don't know if this is in your paper, but what is your current activity with instituting this locally?
oh, through Gresham.
Yeah.
I mean, I still need to find like a lawyer. Nick and I have been doing a tiny amount of work trying to adapt another basic income app to build a Gresham prototype. So we're gonna work on that tomorrow, but we haven't made much
So
progress
it's going
yet.
to be done by tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But the app is only part of it, right?
It's
So most of it is how do you fund the reserves?
Yeah, that's
and,
what I was
yeah,
gonna
that kind of
ask.
thing. Yeah. So nothing on that.
The app will attract people with its fantastic usability. And
The app will attract people. The economics paper will attract people. My blog will attract people. Somehow we're going to attract people. Yeah.
I'll download the app when you're done with it.
See?
Okay. Cool.
Oh, so you're working on a paper? Or
I have an economics paper. It's 50 pages long. I sent it to Nick, but I'm working on revising it right now. So.
Isn't it posted, the paper?
No.
It was posted.
Just a white paper.
Oh, just the white paper, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, there's all the stuff on the Gresham website.
Right.
Anyway, that's kind of I'm more interested in talking about government, how governments would do it here. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Well, if there's a few more minutes, I wanted to go back to this kind of thought experiment, like you're Hugo Chavez in 1999,
Yeah,
and you, instead of doing this other stuff, you instituted basic income.
yeah,
I guess maybe, sort of in the devil's advocate mode, I was thinking, maybe that would only accelerate the movement of the screw manufacturing business to China, right? Let's say Chinese competition is lowering profits and wages in those factories. Now people have, they don't have a gun to their head anymore, and they say, I don't need to make screws.
sure.
I have a bigger share as a working class person in Venezuela. Because of the basic income, I have a bigger share of the profits from these high oil prices.
Yeah,
And nothing about the basic income would keep oil prices from crashing when they crashed. Right?
Sure.
It would have made things worse.
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one. I know that the screws, et cetera, were exports. So if you have a broader base of consumers, that certainly creates an incentive to. There's some stuff you can't import, so that creates an incentive to provide services locally and certain local industry and stuff like that. I think if you're letting the market, kind of stay open, then there's more money, there's more profit to be made from consumers in Venezuela, and maybe they'll be importing some stuff too. But you've already got like a strong industrial economy. You've got strong businesses. I don't imagine that it would hurt. I think what really killed the Venezuela economy, like the oil crash, was kind of like the final straw. But before that, all of kind of these market restrictions, price controls, and that kind of stuff was what did it in. And if you have a basic income and you're not doing this other stuff, and you don't have minimum wage, and you're allowing supply to meet demand, and allowing competitive business, then maybe you're not going to run into
Like, I
that.
guess you've still got some infrastructure already there and like other opportunities to make profit. Like just
Right.
because you have some profit from your basic income doesn't necessarily stop you from wanting to do more if it's profitable. But
Yeah.
you had all these controls that made it unprofitable.
And if you set the basic income too high, like David was saying, then you'll get some inflation for a little while, and then it will equilibrate. And then there's incentives. People want more money. People want maybe they won't be doing exactly the same things they were doing before. But there's people want more stuff. And
But it seems like a basic income wouldn't fit in a country that had ideology like that. I mean,
it doesn't fit in any country's ideology right now.
yeah. Well,
It's
no,
better
but it
than
would
socialist
fit.
country.
Yeah, I would
Me
agree.
saying that
Well, I don't know about
there needs to be free market going on, and that's not going to happen in some
Right.
countries.
Um,
I mean, that's not.
It's not that there needs to be a free market going on, but I think if you you could start by having free markets going on and saying, oh, wait a minute, people are poor, and a lot of people aren't able to access what the markets can provide. Maybe we need a basic income. But you could also go the other way and implement a basic income and then say, oh, wait, maybe we don't need all of these other restrictions on the markets that are distorting the labor market and stuff like that. So the basic income can allow people to see that, oh, the free markets can be really efficient, and as long as people have the money to buy the stuff.
There'd be more of a change, though, psychologically involved, I would think.
In one direction than the other?
The anti-Western sentiment is huge in Venezuela, or has been,
Yeah.
and in other companies, or countries, rather, that are
But that's only an issue if it's
socialist.
pitched as a Western import.
Right.
Right, but I
If
mean,
Hugo
I'm just
Chavez is
saying
like, so
that-
as a socialist country, we should give everyone free money.
Right.
Like, fuck the
Right.
West, who like says that you need like
Right.
that you're dependent on like your capitalist exploiters.
Right.
Right.
You could spin it maybe in that way.
Spin it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Oh,
so.
the Boulevard dividend.
Well, I think
The Boulevard
I think
dividend,
like
yeah.
Alex's view, like he said, is kind of doesn't fit with either one because our economy it's more natural to feel that that you have a free market, but it's not so natural to just give people money from the state. Feels like a
Right.
lot of government
So-
spending, a really big government, and they kind of have the flip side where it's like not natural to have free markets, but maybe is more natural to give people money
Right.
I
from
think-
the state. Yeah.
I think the bottom line is that politics is tricky, and
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to pretend to be an
Right.
expert on how to convince governments to do
Right.
stuff and how to spin
Right.
basic income in a way that's appealing to socialists or appealing to capitalists or something like
But
that.
you do envision it as a global thing.
Eventually.
Yeah,
Over
I mean,
time.
I envision it as ideally a global thing, because we live in a global economy, and I imagine having a single global currency and all of
Yeah.
that. But
I was just going to ask,
Yeah.
you envision it being a single income for everyone throughout the world?
yes, yeah, yep. And then in some places you're going to have a cheaper cost of living and stuff like that. So you would see migration to the cheaper areas potentially, and prices equilibrate throughout the world.
Should we go around in our last few minutes?
Let's go around in our last few minutes. Anyone have any final thoughts about Venezuela, basic income, and everything we talked about today?
I guess I just feel
Go
like
ahead.
I learned, like I came in not knowing that much about it, and I feel like I have a stronger sense of what might have happened in Venezuela and why you saw the inflation that you saw, particularly some of the different factors. There's a lot of them that kind of tanked the productive capacity. And I guess I keep coming back to this thread of like, is there anything that, in addition to free markets, that you need to do to kind of make sure that you have robustness in your productive capacity, that you're not overly dependent like on one thing that could then crash or some shock to the structure being too easy to have happen. So that's my main thing.
Yeah, David.
I'm still. I think that the idea that a basic income and the subsidy of basic components or inputs to people's lives, I think that the subsidy of those kind of basic components is about as close as any country gets to a basic income at this point in time. And I realize it's an arguable and debatable fact, but I think that generally speaking, it is a push in a similar vein. And I just think that's really interesting how poor that went for them. They could have approached those subsidies in a different way, I think, where they wouldn't have hurt the manufacturers and they would have subsidized the production rather than subsidized the product. There's other things they could have done there, and I just think it's a vein that has gone unexplored, and I don't think it could be explored here because of the nature of this. But I think, like, in general in the world, it's a vein that's gone unexplored.
Well,
I learned a lot, like Bethany. Thank you.
okay.
That's great.
Elizabeth.
I think I still don't entirely. I feel like I understand better, although not entirely, obviously. How you see free markets is really important for this, which I'm interested to sort of struggle with because I'm still low key a socialist / anti-capitalist, and I'm like, oh, this makes me sad.
What?
Okay.
Yeah,
Roma.
That'd be good to talk about more sometime because we sort of throw it around as if everyone is on the same page sometimes.
I do not assume that everyone's on the same page.
I'm not saying maybe I shouldn't.
Let's go to Roma.
Anyway, all right.
Yeah.
This is just a great example of the power of economics and following the money, and it's just amazing how people's lives can be altered drastically from one extreme because they were a very prosperous nation to another one within the span of 20 years. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And it's all because of, politics, power-hungry people, but then their decisions there on how to run the economy have resulted in pain. It's crazy.
Yeah. Under true.
I don't really know.
Okay. Alex?
Yeah, I learned a lot about, or at least a little bit more about some of the sort of pieces that go into sort of how inflation and the economy works, and thanks to the explanations about currency reserves that I hadn't really thought about. So it's helpful for me to just sort of flesh out like how all this works. And so I'm still building my intuition on this, and I think it's good to come from. One thing I appreciate about these meetups, we come from. It's like we've got this one interesting kind of tool, and we're kind of approaching it from different angles, and then we can sort of like build, at least in my head, kind of a model of like how economies work in general, which, and then understanding how like basic income can like contribute to that. So that was good.
Cool. Nick.
Yeah, all that stuff. Also, I think it's interesting and complicated, and I think maybe it's easy to when we're thinking about basic income, for me anyway, I think easy to ignore the complexities introduced by national political boundaries and geography, and one of the things that struck me was the potential parallel between, obviously it's not as extreme, but we had this big imbalance with China. Like Venezuela was getting many of its consumer goods from outside, and we're getting many of our consumer goods from outside, and we're not so much selling them oil, we're selling them dollars, and we can do that because we have this dominant position in the global economy. But if that doesn't last, then we could maybe be in a situation that's like a little bit like what happened to us.
Yeah. So this is great. I learned a lot of interesting facts, especially about the ability for Venezuela to sell its oil. And I think, as people said, a lot of it is about the ideology of the government. But I think the real problem is that baked into these, I do believe that most of these ideologies come from a place of wanting to help people and wanting to make the country prosperous and, take care of the people. And then I think embedded in some of these ideologies is maybe a misunderstanding of how the economy works. And then it ends up causing harm. And, I think the corruption and all of that stuff kind of follows just from the perverse incentives that are generated from misunderstanding of the economics.
A nice way to put it. Misunderstanding.
Yeah, it's all a big misunderstanding. All right, thanks, guys.
Bye, live stream. I learned a lot.